Hello and welcome to day 5 of Webit Global Impact Week. 5 amazing days full of truly phenomenal and inspirational discussions and keynotes and fireside chats and mind-blowing and eye-opening talks from our keynoters. It's fascinating. I'm really grateful to the entire Global Webit team and to everyone involved in this special edition, bringing together over 100,000 people from all around the world, over 190 countries. And particularly today, I would like to mention the names of Stanley Georgiev, who is the chair of our Media and Entertainment Committee, and mentioning names, our chief producer, Elena Georgieva, doing this whole thing, and the amazing production team head by Polly and Chris and Vanya. Well, this is a great team, guys, and let's start. Let's start now. Of course, the entire Webit team, the entire TVS team, being involved with making this huge event, 5 days, 12 hours per day, all time zones possible. Now, I started with hello because you never know if it's a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or somewhere in the middle for everyone around the world who is with us. But above all, use the TVS platform to network, comment, chat, and build relations, because that's what matters. It's great to have our 2 hybrid locations in Sofia and Miami, and having all of you either in person or virtually with us. Now, we start this fantastic day committed and dedicated to everyone in the media and entertainment world in times when NFTs and art and entertainment, particularly digital, virtual realities, some companies rebrand themselves for the sake of the metaverse. This is the new world. And today is going to be truly exciting because we will explore this world to the boundaries and beyond. Our first fireside chat today is on the topic of power of media and early childhood programming, a very important topic when it comes to the future. And isn't it that the reason we do what we do, for the future of our kids and grandchildren? So that's why it's so important. That's why we start with this topic with a moderated by Christina Zdanowicz, senior producer at CNN. Christina, the floor is yours.
Hello, and welcome to a fireside chat on the power of media and early childhood programming. My name is Christina Zdanowicz. I'm a senior producer with CNN Digital, and I'm also a board chair of a youth development nonprofit for teens called Vox ATL, and I'm your moderator for today. As many of us grew up with, myself included, Sesame Street has long been a staple in many households. Children have learned their ABCs and their 1, 2, 3s from the likes of Sesame's special characters. Sesame Street has even been able to educate children about the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to introduce you to Sherrie Westin, who is the president of Sesame Workshop, which is the nonprofit educational organization behind Sesame Street. Hi, Sherrie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's such a thrill to be a part of the Webit Global Impact Week. So thank you so much for having us.
And before we get started, if anyone in the audience has any thoughts or questions, I invite you to share them on social media with #Webit. Okay, let's get down to some Sesame business. Sesame Street has been bringing families together for more than 50 years, both in the US and in 150 countries around the world. Tell us a little bit about what Sesame Street has become over the course of the past 50 years for children and caregivers.
Well, I'd love to. So as you point out, Sesame Street has now been around for over 50 years. And I think most people know us as the iconic US television show. but often folks don't really know the depth and breadth of our work, and may not realize that Sesame Workshop is a nonprofit, mission-driven organization that creates Sesame Street around the world. Our mission is to help children everywhere grow smarter, stronger, and kinder. It sounds like a great tagline, but it's actually true in everything we do. As you talk about letters and numbers, yes, smarter in terms of the academic basics, but stronger in terms of health and resilience, kinder in terms of empathy and understanding. And we've had a long history of using the power of media, storytelling, and our engaging Muppets to teach, but also to model behaviors and open hearts and minds. And I think that we have spent an enormous amount of effort focusing on some of the most difficult issues that children face, and doing that always in a way that respects a child and is from the lens of a child. One of my favorite sort of stories from the origins of Sesame Street is also around Joan Gans Cooney, who was our founder, and she talked about how she thought she was creating the quintessential American show. The first multiracial cast, it's on a stoop in Harlem, and yet within a year, Germany, Mexico, Brazil, all reached out because they wanted their own local productions of Sesame Street. And that's what started our productions around the world. And in many of those countries, Bangladesh, India, South Africa, we're creating content, local content, and reaching children, many of whom have no other access to quality early education. So we like to say, you said 150 countries, you're correct, Christina. We like to say Sesame Street is now the longest street in the world. And actually, Sesame Workshop is the largest informal educator of young children around the world.
That's incredible. I mean, just like the power and the reach and being global, when you said, yeah, I mean, it definitely started as something that people in the US grew up with. It's still an icon, but it's been able to reach so many people around the world that, hey, maybe this is their first taste of educational programming, or maybe this is their window into, what life is like on that stoop in Harlem. It's kind of amazing what it's become. And I mean, one thing that's really interesting is that Sesame is often at the forefront of some of the biggest issues facing kids, whether it's the effect of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic or the Syrian refugee crisis. How do you guys decide what to tackle?
Well, everything we do is based on research. We're a research-based organization, not only on formative research, but also summative research in order to test, are we having the desired educational outcomes and impact? We also work really closely with partners on the ground. And so we are always learning what are the most difficult issues that children are facing. And I think if you think about our whole purpose, like Sesame is always focused on those early years when we know we can have the greatest impact. It was created as a huge experiment to see if television could teach, but also to help those who had less access to quality education arrive at school ready to learn with the skills, both the academic and the social emotional skills. So as we see issues, as we see trends that derail children, that's how we decide what to address, in terms of issues that are creating stressful, prolonged exposure to stress for children, which literally inhibits brain development. That allows us to say, okay, is that parental incarceration? Is it parental addiction? Is it displacement? You mentioned the Syrian refugee crisis. And are there things that Sesame can do to help address those issues from a lens of a child, to help do so in an optimistic way, to help give families and caregivers tools to help children cope with those issues? And I'll tell you one other thing that I think is a huge asset for Sesame, and it also goes back to our founder, to Joan Gans Cooney and her colleagues. First to focus on the early years. Now we have the brain science to prove, how prescient that was, because it is the most critical time in a child's brain development. But secondly, Joan had a hunch that if she appealed to adults as well as children, that if adults were watching with a child, the learning would be deeper. And of course, today we have the science to prove that as well, that the way a child learns is through engagement with a caring adult. And even more important, if a child is experiencing significant stress, the most important thing to mitigate the impact of that stress on their healthy brain development is more engagement with a caring adult. It's called nurturing care. So the reason that Joan had Muppets and humor and parodies and celebrities and musicians was a deliberate appeal to adults. And we see today, whether it's our work in the Syrian response region, in refugee camps, in all sorts of environments with particularly vulnerable children, that our appeal to adults as well as children is a tremendous benefit as we're trying to create content that is not only a tool for the child, but a catalyst for more engagement between adult and child. And I think that's how Sesame is so effective in giving their children and their caregivers the tools to build resilience and to put them on a path to thrive.
I could only imagine, like, if a parent and child, like when my dad and I would watch Sesame Street, right? Like, you would imagine that conversations would come out of, maybe, I can't remember her name, but the newer Muppet who is on the autism spectrum.
Julia.
Yeah. So it's like maybe have those kind of conversations. Like it could be like a really good entry point.
Absolutely. And we have so much research that shows when we introduced Julia, the first Muppet with autism, that not only did it give a character that children with autism could relate to, helping them feel less alone, but it was such a catalyst for others to understand that it's okay to talk about the fact that Julia has autism, and for children to understand what that means, and not just what makes Julia special or different, but what you have in common with Julia. And we have so much research that did spark so many conversations around children with autism. And that's so important to help break down the stigma, to help make subjects that people think of as taboo, okay to talk about, and giving children the opportunity to do so. I think it's a very powerful contribution.
And I mean, speaking of taboo, Sesame Street, like, recently has done a series of town halls with CNN, which, where I work, on racism, COVID-19, and also the COVID-19 vaccine for children.
Right.
I mean, how did all these come together, and what has the response been?
Well, CNN actually came to us early on when I think in the spring of 2020, and we had already created a program, a large initiative called Caring for Each Other, and that was in response to the global pandemic. We immediately pivoted, as everyone did, to figure out how do we respond, how do we produce, how do we work in quarantine, in lockdown, but also how do we address these issues and concerns for children and families. And we created content that was, has been rolled out in over 100 countries, over 40 languages. So CNN reached out to us and said they had an idea to do town halls for families that would address children's questions, which we loved. And we put the first one together just in a matter of weeks. It allowed us to have experts on child development, on the pandemic itself, on what it means, and then to also have our Muppets. And we had children asking questions. And I think they have been so powerful. We've done 6 now. And it's not like one and done. We would do it around back to school, around the holidays. As this continued, there were additional questions and issues we could help address, help explain. One of my favorite moments was when a child asked in the holiday town hall if Santa would still be able to come. And Dr. Fauci, who was a guest, said, in fact, he had been to the North Pole and had vaccinated Santa. So it was like Fauci saves Christmas. I loved it. And then you point out too, we did our most recent town hall when vaccinations were available for children 5 and up, to answer questions around vaccinations. And when you ask what the response has been, you see the power of our characters to raise issues, to really help people look at these issues from a child's standpoint. And when Big Bird got vaccinated and talked about his wing being a little bit sore, but he was fine, that became a huge viral event. But the whole point is for us to help reassure. We have these trusted characters, and I think that's a tremendous contribution.
When we got the questions coming in, I was actually like on the receiving end, seeing the questions come in from the audience, both from parents and from children. And I don't know if this one made it in, but there was a 4-year-old girl from the East Coast somewhere and asked, like, will it hurt? And then another child asked, can I bring my stuffy with? Can my stuffy be?
So sweet, right?
I know, it's like, that's coming from a child, and it's coming from this earnest place of curiosity.
Yeah, no, we also found, when we first were in lockdown, and we literally had to send the Muppets home, like the Muppets home to the Muppeteers, because we all had to produce from home. And so the specials we created to help, give learning opportunities through media, but also to help parents have ideas on how to turn playful opportunities at home into learning opportunities. But we also heard that because those specials looked like Zoom calls, it looked like us, but with Muppets, that children also could relate, like, okay, even the Muppets are having to do what I have to do now. And again, I think it speaks to Sesame's sort of ability to respond to the most pressing issues of the day. And of course, a global pandemic, the need for what we do has never been greater.
Well, I don't know when this will be, but when we are in a post-pandemic world, what do you predict will change for education and early childhood education? And are there any opportunities that the pandemic presents?
Well, I will say, 1.8 billion children were out of school. So again, the fact that Sesame was created to see if television could reach children and teach, and particularly those who didn't have other access to education. So obviously, this is what we were made for. But I will say we had to be innovative. We had to, yes, we could create content to reach children through television, through radio. We also looked for every other means possible, digital, WhatsApp, chatbots, high tech, low tech. And again, yes, this pandemic will eventually subside, but we know that those learnings on what was most effective to reach children and families when you can't be there in person will benefit us in the long run. And we're even researching what was most effective. And I think that we have to be prepared to do this again. We have to learn from what we did, because there will be future crises, and there will be, whether it's climate related, what have you, there will be needs to reach children and families through remote learning. And so I think that is an opportunity for us to learn and I think it's also important. I believe that there's been more recognition of the critical importance of reaching children and reaching children in those early years. That's something we've always been focused on, but given the pandemic, I think there is an appreciation for the priority of investing in the early years, how critical that is, and that we have to reach caregivers and parents. During the pandemic, parents became children's teachers, right? And particularly young children. So to give them the tools to help them understand how play can be learning moments, how we can help build resilience for children, help them understand and cope with the social emotional issues from a pandemic. And lastly, I would just say how important resilience is. You talk about children are the architects of society. And we certainly know that when children are in conflict and crisis settings, if we're not focusing on reaching children, particularly young children, to help mitigate the trauma they're experiencing, then we're not giving them the tools they need to thrive, to rebuild their societies. And I think that's an important learning from this pandemic, that's just something we have to prioritize.
I mean, it's so hard, especially because with the kids who are maybe going to preschool or, preschool or just, having play dates with other kids, like that was social emotional learning that they were losing on maybe. So it's even more important to reach kids where they are at home during the pandemic, online, on social. Well, they're not on social, maybe their parents are, on TV, right? So it just like speaks to the need that we just have to be ready. We all have to be ready because
Right.
we don't know what's going to happen.
Well, and it's to provide basic education, yes, but also to build that resilience if we're going to have sustainable development. That's so important. And to give parents tools to help provide learning moments. I mean, that was one of the biggest challenges. Parents they don't have a preschool to send a child to. They need to be able to provide that learning and provide those opportunities. And I think that's so important.
And this is our last question, but it's kind of a biggie. How does Sesame help create a foundation for a positive relationship with media for the growing generation? And what is your vision for the future?
Well, I think that, one thing we really know is the power of media to reach children, but also the power of these characters to become powerful role models for young children. So it's not just teaching letters and numbers, it's helping children see themselves reflected on screen. Thinking back to the first multiracial cast, so many people have told me the first time they saw a child who looked like them was on Sesame Street. And when you think about, you mentioned Julia, for autistic children to see themselves reflected, to feel less alone. We have had, so many instances around the world where we were able to use the power of these engaging characters and the power of media to not only reach and teach, but to change attitudes and open hearts and minds. I think about our work around gender equity, where we have many powerful girl role models, Muppets, around the world, and they are always equals to their little boy Muppets. They are always dreaming big, inspiring young girls to think of possibilities. We talk a lot about the importance of girls' education. Our little girl Muppets often wear their school uniforms. And it's not only inspiring young girls, but it's showing young boys that it's okay for girls to go to school, that it's important for girls to have different roles and responsibilities. And again, I mentioned that everything we do research, we test outcomes. And some of my favorite results have been in developing countries where we test attitudes of gender equity, and little boys say that they agree watching their favorite Muppet, and they believe that their attitudes of gender equity increase as much as 30%, that it's okay for girls to go to school. And even hearing from parents, fathers who say that they've changed their minds about permitting their children going to school, their daughters from going to school, because of watching these productions. And I think that really speaks to the power of media and Muppets to plant the seeds for societal change. So I think we will continue to do that. We continue to look at the most pressing needs affecting children and using our power of reach and our power of engagement and these incredible role models to help children address those issues and to thrive. That's what we're here for.
That's wonderful. And I mean, like for me, I've always been team Cookie Monster. So I don't know what that says about me. C is for Cookie, C is also for Christina. And Oscar the Grouch. I don't know. I love these like surly characters that show that, hey, you're going to have the grump on the street and all these other wonderful personalities.
Well, and children learn best when they see themselves reflected, as I mentioned, on TV, and when they can relate to characters and their storylines. And that's something we put so much thought into, and it's a really powerful tool.
Well, thank you so much for all the insight into, like the research that goes into coming up with the things that you guys follow up on, whether it's the pandemic or the refugee crisis, or also what kind of characters maybe would be more representative of kids around the world that they want to see, that parents want to see. It's been a really great conversation. I just want to say thank you so much for your time, Sherrie.
Well, Christina, thank you so much for including us, and it was a delight to be here.